Ja, herzlich willkommen, meine
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests in front of your screens, unfortunately, once again, but I'm quite happy that I can welcome you tonight to the event. Will Germany stop the export of banned pesticides? So we're conducting this event together with PAN Germany, INKOTA, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and the BUND Germany. And before we start, I would like to make a few technical remarks.
Dear guests, before we start, I would like to give some technical advices. This event will be translated simultaneously. So if you want to listen to English, please press the button on your lower left side with the Earth button and choose the language you want to listen. So I hope you have done that. And I will directly switch to German. Genau. Und dann noch ein zweiter Hinweis.
And a second remark, you can raise questions via the Q&A, or in German, the F&A tool. I'm sure you know it after 2 years of pandemic. So at the bottom of the screen, you have the possibility to enter questions. There's this Q&A tool, as I said. And first of all, we will listen to 2 short inputs, then we will have a panel discussion. And whenever you feel like it, you can ask questions via this function, and I will try to pick them up and bring them into the discussion. And you can also incorporate the name of the person that the question is directed at. Well, now we would like to start.
Recording in progress.
Will there be an export ban for banned pesticides? Well, we've long known the problem. Certain pesticides have been banned in Germany, within the EU, due to their poisonous effect or harmful effect for human beings and the environment. So they're either banned or the approval was withdrawn. But nevertheless, they are still being exported to other countries. In particular, we see a dramatic situation in countries where people are, for different reasons, subject to much less protection against the poisoning than in Germany, and where the legislation to protect the environment is much weaker. So the problem is, in practice, this export is not illegal. It is definitely legal, but the coalition agreement of the new German coalition government says that the government wants to address this problem. So this was actually the reason why we, as an organization who has long looked into this problem, to conduct an event or set up an event on this topic. So what needs to happen? What is the big issue here? What are the effects on other countries, and what can or what should the next steps be that we have to take? So I'm quite happy to be able to welcome the new Green Parliamentary State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry for Food and Agriculture, Ophelia Nick. So welcome to you, Ms. Nick, and I'm also looking forward to the panelist Mark Orea, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. So welcome, Mr. Orellana. Nice to have you here tonight. And I'd also like to welcome very cordially, and I've already heard that we have 30 degrees centigrade in South Africa with warm water and summerly temperatures. Colette Solomon, the director of the project Women on Farms. So thank you very much, Colette, that despite this beautiful weather we just heard of, you joined us here tonight. And I'd also like to welcome very cordially my co-organizer, Lena Luig from the INKOTA-netzwerk, Jan Orhan from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and Susan Hafmans from PAN Germany. So thank you very much to all of you for being here. And I'd like to pass the floor to you, Susan, for a short input, and you will tell us what the actual problem is. Well, thank you very much. When we ask ourselves the question whether Germany should have a stop on banned pesticides, then of course this means that we have to look into the issue of double standards. We all know that the pesticides do not only have a harmful effect on certain plants, fungi, or pests that we want to destroy, but also other organisms. So they have a negative effect on bees, amphibians, or also humans. And the EU has already withdrawn the approval of some of these particularly problematic pesticides to protect the users, the population, and the environment. And farmers in Germany or France or Italy are prohibited from using pesticides with these active ingredients. And we've already heard that the pesticide manufacturers in Europe, however, continue to produce these pesticides and also continue to export them and generate profit. German companies are also involved. So every year they export thousands of tons of these pesticides, irrespective of the fact that these countries have weak pesticide legislation and the protection of the population there is quite weak. So, for example, the highly dangerous cyanamide exported by AlzChem from Bavaria, exported to Ethiopia, India, for example, or the highly dangerous cyfluthrine, which is sold by Bayer to Uganda, the Philippines, or South Africa. And these double standards in the pesticide trade urgently need to be ended. And the EU Commission has already said that it's going to take action. And as we've already heard, the new coalition agreement includes a chapter on that, that we need a national regulation on that. So one of the problems of the exports and the widespread use of these highly dangerous pesticides is shown in the figures on poisonings. So over decades, this was actually ignored, and people relied on figures from the 1980s and 90s, where people thought that we have 25 million pesticide poisonings annually. However, a study published in 2020 by Bödecker et al. Corrected this view, and they have shown that on an annual basis, we have approximately 385 million acute unintentional pesticide poisonings. And predominantly, people in rural areas are affected by that in the global south, especially in Asia and in Africa. And in particular, in these regions, the number of highly hazardous pesticides is particularly high, and the people are dramatically exposed to these pesticides. And based on these acute poisonings, of course, we also have to assume a particularly high chronic burden on the population. In some regions of the world, the pesticide exposure has become a human rights issue. We know examples from Paraguay and Brazil, for example. Already in 2017, the then UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food highlighted that there's a clear human rights violation when people are harmed by the export of toxic substances, and she called for a binding regulation to avoid double standards. This call has since been reiterated by other human rights experts, and I'm quite pleased that the UN Special Rapporteur, Marcos Oriana, is here today and can tell us more about it. Under his mandate, at the beginning of 2021, the German government was admonished in an open letter to fulfill its human rights obligations and to stop exporting pesticides that are banned in the EU. And now I would like to pass the floor to Jan Orhan from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation.
Thank you. As I said, my name is Jan Orhan. I'm for this program in the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in South Africa. Before we enter the panel discussion, I'd like to highlight three aspects. One is companies that actually make profit on this business with double standards. I'd like to comment on the consequences for the environment and also the problem of the residues in foods. Bayer and others make good business when it is about these exports. The five big companies, Bayer, BASF, Syngenta as well, make over a third of their turnover with highly toxic substances. And that means due to WHO and FAO, they have a very high potential to be harmful for the environment and also for the humans. Bayer and BASF are right in the front of this issue. They sell pesticide products with ingredients and substances that are not allowed in the US. Alone in South Africa and Brazil, they sold at least 28 of these substances in 2020, which is according to an INKOTA-netzwerk and Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. This study also documents cases in which pesticides from BASF and Bayer are used in order to, or by creating harmful toxications and other illnesses in the rural workers in citrus farms in South Africa. Some of these had to be treated in hospital. Bad consequences for the environment after research of Public Eye and Unearth within only 4 months in 2020, nearly 4,000 tons of insecticides from the neonics were exported, although they are prohibited in the EU. They contain imidacloprid, thiamexam, and chloridine. In the EU, these are prohibited due to their toxicity. Although the EU has prohibited applying these to its own field, it still allows the agricultural corporates to export them. And again, here in the exports, in the big business is companies from Belgium, France, and Germany. Not a surprise. And Bayer and BASF, for example, sell these bee toxic pesticides to West Africa. The consequence is the bees die. And in the cacao and the coca plantations, we have to pollinate by hand. What are neonics? These are nerve toxides that attack the central nervous system of the bees. And that's why they have been in criticism for a long time. Even in low dosages, they can paralyze or kill the bees, and they harm the orientation and learning capacity of the animals. And dying of insects is a big problem worldwide. 3/4 of all plants and food crops are pollinated by bees and other pollinators. So the consequence is fewer bees, fewer pollinators means less food and less difference in the food. And the export of highly toxic pesticides is not a one-way road. Residues in foodstuff are a great danger for human beings as well. Applying pesticides always leaves residues in the food, which many people are subjected to, especially in the global south. Lots of this is imported to the EU and gets to our plates as well. For every pesticide approved in the US, it is defined how much residue can be in the foodstuff, and if these values are exceeded, they can't be traded. In the EU, they are tested and simplified every year and published. In 2019, nearly 4% of the food from the EU surpassed these limit values. Despite of all of these, the EU has stronger regulations than non-EU countries, especially in the global south. An example in tomatoes and cabbage from 3 different areas in Kenya, 2020 had 25 different pesticides found and 51% of these had long been taken off the market in Europe. And it's especially worrying in this is that these two vegetables are the basic foodstuff of the population in Kenya. Also, tomatoes from Nigeria proved higher residues, amongst others in permethrin, which is probably cancerous. Beans regularly have too high contaminations, and that means they are subject to the export ban. And that takes me to the end. That was a very brief introduction of Susan and myself into the topic that we're going to discuss tonight. And I'm looking forward to an informative evening together with you. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll hand back over. Thank you, Susan Hafmans and Jan Orhan, for that overview so far. And with that, I'd like to open the first round of discussion and talk with my guest on how big is the problem from their point of view. And the person who probably has the best overview of this worldwide is Marcos Oriana. And Marcos, I have presented you just now. You are the Special Rapporteur for Toxics and Human Rights. Civil institutions can only have spotlight studies. You, if I see it correctly, combine or carry a lot of this information together and know very well what's going on in the different countries and what the dimension of the problem is. Pesticides are a problem. Poisoning from them is as well. How big would you assume this problem of prohibited pesticides exported to other countries, leading to intoxications there, is relevant?
Thank you, Christine. First of all, for the introduction. Thank you for the organizers of this event for the space, inviting me to join. I am delighted to do so. Your question is very timely, Christine. We've seen the day before yesterday how the Stockholm Resilience Center, so this is a scientific group based out of Sweden that a few years ago has come out with a conceptual framework defining the safe space for humanity that identifies planetary boundaries. It has come out with a study focusing on chemical pollution and how humanity has exceeded its planetary boundary on chemical pollution. I think that's the right framing for your question, Christine, because my mandate on toxics and human rights, as you said, it was created by, it's a special procedure of the Human Rights Council, and it is a monitoring and reporting mandate. And so it receives a large number of information from many countries. And so this problem of existing double standards in global pesticide trade has come to become one of the priorities of the mandate because of the toxification of the planet and what that means for the enjoyment of human rights of people around the world. There are several big problems associated with double standards. Susan and Jan spoke about the figures. I also wish to highlight the 2022 Pesticide Atlas that was recently published by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation with its partners. More than 300 million people fall ill every year out of exposure to hazardous pesticides. Disproportionate number of people in the global south. Tens of thousands of people die every year. This is a blatant violation of the rights to life and the rights to health of workers in the field, of children that live in agricultural communities. Susan, in her opening, mentioned the letters that I sent to Germany some time ago regarding this question. I also had the opportunity to send a letter to the EU where I point out that these practices reflect odious discrimination and exploitation. They exacerbate global environmental injustice. And that is because the human body is one and the same everywhere. Skin color does not offer protection against hazardous pesticides. In addition to this, I would point out the two big problems associated with double standards. The first one is that it puts the economic incentive in the wrong place because it puts pressure not to innovate, not to substitute for safe alternatives, and to continue the status quo of exploitation and discrimination. So that's one. And secondly, it's ineffective. John spoke about this just now in what's sometimes referred to as the circle of poison, where poisons return to the countries of origin, the countries where they are produced, because the produce is contaminated on the one hand, and also because some of these pesticides, they bioaccumulate, they are persistent, they are capable of long-range transport, and so they return. So this circle of poison is a huge problem. So to wrap up and sum up, the double standards existing currently in international trade are one of the priority issues concerning toxics and exposure and the toxification of a planet from a human rights perspective.
Du hast gesagt, dass du Briefe geschrieben hast, sowohl an die
You said you wrote letters to the German government and the European Union. What were the reactions that you got?
Yes, thanks for following up. I would distill Germany's answer in one line as saying, we recognize that this is a problem and we would want to see progress done at the regional level through the EU. I think that adequately characterizes the several pages in Germany's response. I see that there are several problems with that line. First of all, that leadership requires commitment, it requires action, and it requires action in the face of economic costs. It is often argued, I've heard the argument that national bans or other national action is ineffective because the production of pesticides would simply divert to those other countries that do not have controls, and so the people in the global south would continue to be exposed. A variant of this argument puts heavy emphasis on competitiveness considerations, but I would say with this kind of argumentation, as an international community, we would not make progress on so many joint issues. We would not make progress on the climate emergency. We would not make progress on biodiversity loss. And certainly we will not make progress on the toxification of the planet. Change requires vision. It requires a moral conviction. And Germany, I would say, has been a leader in the chemicals and waste field. It is, for example, hosting the International Conference on Chemicals Management that is set to identify and design the post-2020 global approach to sound management of chemicals. But leadership requires doing the right thing out of conviction, despite the economic costs, which usually are short-term in any event. And so in driving change and establishing direction, that's where human rights and particularly the rights to life, the right to health, the right to a healthy environment that has been recently recognized at the global level, the right to food, the right to water, they provide a moral compass for measures that need to be applied at the national level to begin to reverse the toxification of the planet.
Ganz kurze Frage, Markus.
A very brief question again. Were you surprised by the answer, or did you expect that kind of answer to come, that there's nothing that is very ambitious?
Well, in terms of expectations, my expectation is that by raising the visibility of these issues, there may be movement and steps taken. And I have been encouraged by the inclusion in the EU Chemical Strategy for Sustainability of a pledge to phase out the export of pesticides and other chemicals that are banned for use in the European Union because of their health and environmental impacts. Of course, there's no obstacle for countries to go beyond that and act more quickly, and some countries have taken leadership. But that said, it will be important for the EU to adopt EU-wide regulations on this matter that can further strengthen its approach to chemicals management and make a positive contribution around the world. In that sense, I'm also encouraged by the EU's Green Deal and its pledge to reduce toxic chemicals throughout. That this is a big agenda, and so moving to a toxic-free environment is certainly a step in the right direction.
Okay, dazu kommen wir nachher auch noch mal mehr.
Oh, okay, we'll talk in more detail about that later on, but now I would like to address my next panelist, Colette Solomon. Colette, thank you very much that you are here tonight, and we've heard a lot already about the basic global implications. For example, Jan Urhan mentioned some examples, and the organization of which you are a director, Women on Farms, as the title already says, has a special focus on women in agriculture. So how do pesticides impact, or also poisonous situations impact women, in particular women in the agricultural sector?
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this very important debate. Discussion. It's very important for the workers in South Africa who harvest the grapes that people in the European Union, in Germany, enjoy, who work on the wine fields the wines that the Germans also enjoy. So for us, it's a very, very important and much neglected discussion. And I think also for workers in South Africa, we are, I think, very encouraged by the preliminary or initial discussions happening with the new German government, some of the preliminary undertakings that seem to be on the agenda, the fact that it's on the agenda, and so on. So I think as workers, farm workers in South Africa, these are very encouraging signs for us. So in order to think about the impacts, I know the other speakers have spoken about the more than 300 million acute poisonings that happen every year in the global South. And so the workers in South Africa who work in the vineyards make up those numbers. And the main two ways in which farm workers in South Africa are exposed to pesticides is when they are working, but also when they are at home. So when they are working, the majority of women farm workers in particular work as seasonal workers. And as seasonal workers, they don't enjoy the same rights, the same protections, the same benefits that permanent male workers enjoy. So for example, the majority of women seasonal workers are not afforded protective clothes. For example, I've got just some very small quotations from some of the women farm workers that we work with. So 73% of women workers that we interviewed 300 women, and 73% of those 300 women said they are not given protective clothes. And one woman, Katrina, said, the farmer doesn't give us protective clothes. He tells us if the pesticides aren't dangerous for us, and he says that if the pesticides don't harm the people who eat the grapes, the pesticides can't harm us. Lena said, if you want protective clothes, you have to pay for it yourself. The farmer will buy it and deduct it from your wages. None of us buy protective clothes because we earn so little. We also found that 2 out of every 3 women workers are exposed to pesticides during the course of their work. And this largely happens because the spraying of pesticides happens while women are working. So women, for example, one woman told us, when we are working in one section of the vineyard and want to spray pesticides, the farmer says we must just step outside the block. Then the tractor drives through the block and sprays the pesticides. As soon as they finish spraying, we have to work in that same block of vineyards immediately. And that is just the normal state of affairs. So not only are they exposed to pesticides, number 2, they don't get protective clothes. And number 3, they are forced to re-enter the vineyards almost immediately. And the second, so that's in the workplace. But also
Vielleicht darf ich da einmal
May I
ganz
briefly interrupt you, Colette? Because I think it's quite interesting. At the beginning of the week, we published the Pesticide Atlas that was only published in German so far. One argument that came from the industry several times was that pesticides are safe as long as they are applied in a safe way, in the appropriate way. But what you say is that many people, especially in South Africa, especially women, do not get the chance to safely apply pesticides. This was also what we have described in the Pesticide Atlas based on different scientific studies. So I think this is very important. I mean, you said you interviewed 300 women and the majority of them said either we don't get protective clothing or we have to pay for it ourselves. And so when you have or hear such an argument, in this case, referring to the German industry, which says, well, apply it safely, then you don't have a problem. So do you get angry about that? Or do you say, how can it be that they actually transfer the responsibility to the workers?
Exactly. And I think it's also it demonstrates a great dishonesty, and that they are disingenuous to use that as an argument, because we know that in South Africa, for example, the contextual conditions, the fact that as a worker, I work for a farmer, the farmer gives me certain instructions, I have very limited rights because I'm so dependent on the farmer for my work. So even for men who spray the pesticides, the labels are removed from the pesticides. Workers are not given any training on the pesticides, on the active ingredients, on the safety hazards, on what kind of remedial action they can take, on the potential health risks, etc., etc. So there's no training that farm workers receive. And yet the onus is placed on farm workers to use the chemicals safely in a context where they lack education, they lack power, they lack the ability to really assert their right to information, their right to protection, their right to fair and just labor practices. And of course, we mustn't for one moment think that companies like Bayer and BASF do not know what conditions pertain in the global south. They're very, very conscious of it. It's not a coincidence. It's not something that happens by accident. It is a conscious economic decision which they make to export these hazardous pesticides to countries like South Africa, where they know the rights and the conditions and the contextual circumstances facing farm workers totally override the safe conditions that they are espousing.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Hey, thank you very much for your description. I would also like to now take the 2 other guests into the spotlight, the Parliamentary State Secretary Ophelia Nick and Lena Luig from INKOTA. Ophelia Nick, you have just heard what Mr. Oriana and Ms. Solomon has said. So you have you're now faced with a problem, but you also have the possibility to shape things. So my question to you is, what does the new government want to do in order to counter the problem of double standards? Of course, we have all read the coalition agreement and were quite happy that the problem was mentioned there and that there was a clear statement that the problem needs to end or need to be stopped. But now we are interested in what's the timeline, when do you want to start, and how do you want to start? Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation. And when I got the invitation, I was quite a newbie to the new parliament, and that I'm able to be here in the ministry now was quite a surprise for me as well. And that we are now able to shape those things that are dear to me is also very important. And of course, many things were put into the coalition agreement by 3 different parties who are coming from 3 different political fields and who committed themselves. And sometimes I've got the impression that we have only been in office for 1 month, but we should have started 2 years ago when faced with all the different problems, for example, animal breeding, etc. But today we are looking into a very specific topic, and this is the beautiful thing about the coalition agreement. The agriculture and our objectives concerning the agriculture is quite clear. And also in terms of glyphosate, for example, we said that we want to make use of all the legal possibilities available to us in order to end these double standards and to stop the exports of what has been banned with us for specific reasons. And Mr. Orellana has described it quite nicely. It also comes back to us. I mean, this is also a topic that we have to address, and we have to look into the issue of residues and the maximum allowed residues, because it's not just, of course, that we have lower standards for those products that are actually imported later on than for the products that are produced here. We want to start right away, of course, and I'm quite glad that we are also responsible for the environmental ministry. This is going to be very helpful. And of course, I cannot give you a specific timeline because we have to look into the legislation first, whether we need a new piece of legislation. This is undergoing a review at the moment, but I can assure you that there are many topics in the coalition agreement that we are starting to work on with a lot of enthusiasm, and we want to achieve quick results in the end. And maybe as a last point, we are quite happy that France is now in charge of the EU presidency, and they have provided us with a good example. And we've also seen what Switzerland has already done. And of course, it's not sufficient what we have seen so far. Of course, also at the European and the international level, be it the FAO or elsewhere, we want to fight for the topic reduction of the application of hazardous pesticides and, of course, to protect the biodiversity. Yes, okay. Other ministries have already talked about the Easter package or Easter basket. Maybe this can also be a part of the Easter basket, so to speak. Well, yes, and it's already quite full, actually. Okay. Thank you, Lena. Last year, and we can still see the sign behind you, you have launched a campaign on double standards and demanded quite clearly that highly hazardous pesticides and double standards need to end. What was the reaction among the population? I mean, this is quite an abstract topic, but could you raise the enthusiasm among the population, or could you get positive reactions that something needs to happen? What was the feedback in the population? Thank you very much for the question. Luckily, I can tell you that the feedback was quite positive. So we got a lot of positive feedback from the German population. We collected signatures quite concretely for a national export ban, but at the same time, we also communicated that this would only be one step. And moreover, we would also like to achieve a European-wide export ban and in the medium term also the exit from highly hazardous pesticides. And the package of demands achieved 170,000 signatures all together with the PAN, the Pesticide Action Network, and we were quite happy that the responses were so positive. And I think even though this is a technical issue, the core of it can be easily conveyed. So why should we export pesticides that are banned at home? So this is easy to understand for people. So this is the reason why we also got these positive responses. And beyond the campaign at INKOTA, we have recently conducted a representative research, a representative study, a Forza interview study, and 85% of the people said that they wished that the regulation would be stricter when it comes to pesticides that are banned here and exported to other countries. And this is also, of course, an issue for the federal government. So here's a lot of support from the population in Germany for a change of the regulations. And I would also like to emphasize that also Colette is here on the panel, and there were many other partners in the Global South who contributed to it. And of course, it is a demand that not we in Germany came up with, but of course, this is a clear demand from our partners in the Global South. And for many years, I've been in contact with a large civil society network in Brazil, which is fighting or has been fighting for years for an import ban in this kind, in this case, so that no hazardous substances should be imported that are banned in the countries of origin and the exporting countries. And this is also very important. And in Germany, we are looking at the corporations, Bayer and BASF. We want to exert some pressure on them, but also the German government in order to achieve the right results, because the industry says we are paternalistic, everyone needs to comply with EU standards. And of course, we would not accept the standards of the countries of the Global South, but this is what they say. One question to you, Marcus, from the audience, and basically also to everyone, from Mr. Clemens. Mr. Clemens asks, are there any attempts or plans to sue Bayer or BASF for damages or collective lawsuit? This is actually also a possibility that civil societies are using more and more often. So collective lawsuits. So Marcos or others, maybe you can say something about it.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks for the question. I'd like to comment on it in light of what Lena has just mentioned, because it brings the issue of extraterritorial obligations into focus. We've seen the emergence of climate litigation using human rights standards, using other theories established in law, tort or otherwise. And at first, those cases were very quickly dismissed. I'm speaking when that wave of cases began a few years ago, but more recently they have gained traction at the highest courts in various countries, and we can see how the growing awareness of what happens in one country having repercussions worldwide or in other countries is beginning to take shape and crystallize in human consciousness. And so when it comes to the responsibilities for human rights respect of one country, they do not end at the border. They extend to where activities may have foreseeable negative impacts on human rights, where those activities or the companies that carry them out are under the control of the home states. And this is where remedies come into play. Often remedies are unavailable in the countries where the harm takes place. And that's for a multitude of reasons. It may be because evidence is very hard to obtain. It may be because of statute of limitations. It may be because of the way that judicial systems are set up, the lack of capacity. More generally, when it comes to remedies for pesticide exposure, chemical exposure, more generally, there are very serious obstacles to obtaining justice. And that is an obstacle to these lawsuits, such as co-founding factors. So companies will often claim that people got sick, but they got sick because of some other reason, and proving that it was the pesticide exposure becomes a very, very hard thing. Latency periods. It may well be that people get sick only after a decade after exposure. And so those are real obstacles for litigation. But seeing those obstacles in perspectives highlights once again how the implementation of extraterritorial obligations is a matter of international cooperation. And here again, I want to echo what Lina is saying. It is not only about exports, it's also about imports. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has recommendations for Mexico, for example, to stop the imports of pesticides that are prohibited in the countries of origin. So there are shared responsibilities. The fact that there are shared responsibilities does not mean, however, that the states of export can continue or should continue with the odious practice of double standards.
Mm-hmm. Lena,
Lena, have your partners talked about strategic court filings? Is that something that's been discussed with you? Well, so far we've focused on what can we do legally in Germany, and we know that there is a legal means according to the Environmental Act that there could be an immediate export stop or ban by the Federal Ministry, and I was happy to hear that they are checking whether a new legislation has to be put forward that takes this into the statutes of law and not by decree. This has been done in France, and I think this could be an example. And this should be a law that could not be taken back by the next government, for example. This is what we focused on. But beyond that, there are other means. I know from examples from Brazil, where some federal states filed suits against pharmaceutical companies, For corporates, it's very difficult, as Marcus has just said, to establish the connection between cause and effect, and the symptoms that have to be traced back to a certain product. That is legally very complex. At least we have a delivery chain or supply chain legislation now that puts some responsibility on the suppliers. But in the current legal situation, that is a very difficult approach to take. And we, therefore, as with our institute, have focused on the national legislation in place, and hopefully that will be accompanied respectively. Ms. Nick, a couple of times we've heard the example of France, who is the presidency of the Council at the moment in the EU. What are you going to undertake to not discuss this on the national level, but on the European level as well? And eventually, this could even be an international topic, FAO, OECD. A question in the chat that has been asked in this respect: what are the processes that are already being sketched out now beyond the German level? Well, we've just talked about the court cases. Interesting. I don't want to talk about the US at the moment, where we have thousands of suits against Monsanto and Bayer now, and the new federal government in the work group with the Greens. We have Gerber, who worked for the Ministry of Environment before, and so he's an expert that could be invited. And he had court cases as well. So I'm very comforted by the fact that I don't have to know everything here, as there are other topics as well. But now we have to look at the systems, and I think it's very good to hear the approach and the description of Colette, what it means for women who cannot afford to buy protective clothing. We know that from European countries as well, Spain, for example, where protection is not given, and people have to work with substances that may be hazardous or even lethal. And we do see the magnitude of the topic, and that indicates the steps that we have to take and what we have to do in order to approach this. I'm not so much into the details of these topics as yet. I only know that we have to have a European initiative, and Germany will support this. And Europe has said biodiversity, farm to fork. And the question is, how engaged is Europe in this, and how engaged is the support? Of course, Germany is an important actor in this. And now we will have to look at different resources, environment and agriculture and food. So it's two resources that are in this, and that's a good readiness on the European level to discuss this and look for more support, as we know that not all European countries think the same way. So we'll have to gather some support here, and quite clearly internationally as well, looking towards Russia and China, who also, if they have a high consumption, have a consciousness, an awareness that this is hazardous, and we have to keep up the discussion. That's what we focus on. And Jim Özdemir has also said internationally, this approach is just as important as nationally. We have to go beyond the national limit, and I think that's why we have to see that he is a good partner for your organizations, and a good approach to fight back the hazardous pesticides worldwide. And this is why I'm happy here to be with you. And I'll take back home what I've heard today here. And this is something that we can see. These big tasks that we are facing, we'll not be able to do this alone. We'll have to do this all together. There are lots of questions, and we have to climb a steep and high mountain. And that is why I'm pleased to be here and connect the knowledge and forward it, and get to develop clear answers. Great. That's good to hear. And I'll pick up on that and play the ball to Lena. Now, Lena, you have opportunity to say, okay, what should be step 1, 2, and 3, 4 from your point of view? Marcus, you've got a free shot now, and explain the 3 most important steps that have to be taken. What's the list of priorities, Lena? Well, thank you. Step 1 would be more transparency. We, on one hand, we had the meeting looking at what data is collected on the EU, what's the pesticides that are used on the fields. The same transparency is needed for the exports. For the consumer protection and food safety is responsibility here, and that is quite low still. As an NGO, we had to do detective work in the last years to find out what substances are exported, where to what extent. That is not transparent and not clear and not easy to access. So that's a big point of work, and that is what we need to start on with the work. That will be point one. Point two would be the three steps that I've mentioned. We need a national export ban. We need to have that on European level, and we need the global exit from hazardous pesticides. And the third request would be, of course, to massively promote alternatives. And that's not a new idea at all. So we have to massively right now start in developing alternatives. And I think we need everything that we can get our hands on in this respect. We need more research on agricultural ecology. What could that look like? What could be the scaling? Well, how can we adapt this to different agricultural structures? That's quite clear that we have some best practices from Andhra Pradesh, for example. They can't be directly applied to a structure like in South Africa, for example. We have to think what works, what doesn't work. Can we adapt it? How do we need to adapt it? Could we start using biopesticides as a first step? And we need much more research. We need financial funding for the transition for the farmers in the countries, and of course we need competent consultation, moving this into the focus to how move away from the highly hazardous pesticides to agriculture systems that are ecologic. Markus, do you have anything you'd like to add to what Lena has said?
Well, I couldn't agree more with those points. I would echo them and say, first of all, a national ban on the export of prohibited pesticides is this place to start. I think it's quite encouraging to hear Ophelia speak about the review of possibilities for legal change, a new piece of legislation. Certainly, parliaments know how to do this when the political will is there. Secondly, Germany's leadership at the EU level can make the chemical strategy for sustainability a success. And that is an important role for Germany to play in the region. And thirdly, its leadership at ICCM 5, so this is the International Conference on Chemicals Management, can shed light on a number of processes at the global level, whether it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the Food and Agriculture Organization strategy on highly hazardous pesticides, or whether it is improving or unlocking the Rotterdam Convention. For those who may not be familiar with this convention, this is an instrument that exists internationally to control international trade in dangerous pesticides and other industrial chemicals. But it has been blocked because the governing arrangements, or the conference of the parties, has failed to follow the scientific advice of its chemical review committee, and has been unable so far to adopt controls on a range of hazardous chemicals, including paraquat and asbestos. So unlocking, improving those mechanisms of the Rotterdam Convention can be another area at the global level where Germany's leadership can really have an impact on these double standards practices.
Colette, Ach so, ganz kurz noch.
Colette.
Genau, gleich.
Yeah, Colette can go first. Of course. Colette, from your specific point of view of an organization that is trying to protect the rights of women, so what would you say? In particular, keeping in mind that women are specifically vulnerable, so what should not be neglected at all? What should we keep in mind?
Thank you. So also just to follow up with what Lena was saying about transparency, I think it would be imperative to, as much as possible, involve and cooperate and communicate and be guided by the voices from workers in the global South. So trade unions, women workers in the global South. So to understand what it is they want, what would best protect them, what would best work for them. I also think it will be very important, and maybe this is the cynical side of myself, but I think that it would be important that any legislation that is enacted, contains a grievance mechanism, a compensatory mechanism, whereby a worker working in a vineyard in South Africa would be able to lodge a grievance against a company in the global North, and whereby compensation should also be enabled by corporations in the global North to ordinary workers in the global South. And this should not be too onerous. It should be something that is easily effected and operationalized for women workers in South Africa.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Ophelia, Nick, you have brought, or you were told, many different aspects. I'm sure you are not surprised by the many different aspects that were mentioned. So how do you look at it? How do you see it? Well, it's quite clearly what I have expected. And of course, this is also dependent on the role every one of us is in. And I already mentioned that we can only do this together. So this is why we have to do our homework. Everyone needs to do his or her homework. And I think it's very important what Lena Luig just said. And this is also my mindset, because we are supposed to be the party that wants to ban everything or regulate everything. And others don't want to do this. But the question is, how can we achieve a good framework? And agricultural ecology is, of course, very important. And actually, now the Green Week would have started if we didn't have a pandemic. And there would have been many conferences also of farmers in Germany. And now we see different kind of conferences and new dialogue platforms. And our compass should be the agroecology. So this means stable ecosystems that function properly, that are based on a circular structure. And of course, this also includes the social aspects. I do also consider this as a very important aspect of agroecology. And it's not very easy. Here we need a lot of exchange, also international exchange. And we want to make progress in this regard, because next year, I think we will also see a change. And it's always very difficult to just say, now things have changed, and the farms that have adapted to the former situation, they quickly have to adapt to a new situation. For example, glyphosate. Many farmers use glyphosate. However, many eco farmers they do not use glyphosate. But for the others, for the traditional farmers, it's still a major change to work without glyphosate. And if you just launch new bans, then it's always very difficult for the farmers. So my approach would be to try to do this together and to think about alternatives. What kind of plants, for example, could be used in order to work without pesticides? So it's also about breeding and others. So it's about the whole value chain. It's a holistic approach that is needed. And this is always very difficult, of course. But I think it's very important. In other countries, we also see very stable agricultural systems. And we, for example, have said it's our objective to see 30% eco-agriculture by 2030. This is also very important because there are countries in Africa who have quite an ecological agriculture. In Uganda, for example, with the permaculture, and you tend to think that we have to explain the world to them. But this has actually made a change that we will embark on, and I hope that we'll be successful in the future. But it's not either or, I guess. It's basically both, which is very important. Yes, exactly. So we do not have too much time left, and there are so many questions in the chat. And now I would like to more strongly focus on these questions. For example, Bettina Rudloff asks, a limited export ban will not be able to support comprehensive labor standards, but only to a limited effect. So when it comes to a certain substance. So how would you link it to other measures or other trade incentives, for example, better market access to the EU? So would that be a possibility? And eventually, to draw a bigger picture here, don't we need a big package, basically, to improve labor standards as a whole? So this is actually a question that Marcus and Colette can answer.
Markus, magst du starten?
I'm happy to.
Marcus, would you like to start?
Thank you again. I think that the question is right on point. The measures, in order to be effective, they often need to be part of a package, and so it's not a ban is not seen in isolation. I think the example of Sri Lanka currently is instructive because in its new strategy on agriculture, the government has decided to move quite rapidly away from synthetic pesticides, but without adequate governmental support for the transition. This may actually backlash and cause resistance in the actual farming communities and perhaps even the population at large, because farmers and others do want security of tenure, there's food security considerations and so forth. So it's not just a matter of saying from one day to the other, okay, there's a ban on synthetic pesticides and fertilizers and inputs and so forth, but the whole package that enables the transition to agroecological practices. In that area, the European Union puts a lot of resources into building capacity around the world. And so it's in a way ironic that those resources currently are being compromised by, in their effectiveness, by the continuing export of hazardous pesticides from European countries. So in that sense, a ban in such double practices would further enhance the investments that are already being made at EU-wide level in its international cooperation. But of course, much more needs to be done as part of that package that the question is talking about.
Wie ambitioniert?
Yes, and how ambitious, Marcus, one follow-up question. How ambitious is the FAO when it comes to this question, to this issue?
I think bluntly said, the FAO has not been ambitious enough. At some point, it took many years ago now, it took some action in regards to highly hazardous pesticides, but in time, there is no definitive or even initial list of HHPs for the acronym highly hazardous pesticides. And so there's no targeted action that has been able to remove them from the market. Much of the developments in this field have come from the efforts of non-governmental organization. Pesticide Action Network in particular is one that should be commended for putting out their scientific criteria in order to identify the most hazardous pesticides. So much action needs to happen at the FAO. Recently, there's been talk at the Food and Agriculture Organization of a new strategy on HHPs that may result in the phase out of these dangerous chemicals. We remain to see that strategy and whether it may be adequately implemented. But there are many questions around it, in part because recently the FAO has entered into a memorandum of understanding with CropLife, which is the trade association of the pesticides manufacturers. And so when it comes to the public interests involved in environmental protection, biodiversity protection, public health protection, all threatened by pesticides on the one hand, and the promotion of further sales of pesticides on the other, there's a big question as to where the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations lies.
Ja, also dieses Memorandum of Understanding
Yes, this memorandum of understanding in the civil society has led to a lot of confusion, I have to say. Colette, we have discussed a lot on what needs to happen in Germany and Europe. What's the debate in South Africa with the South African government? I know that our office in Kenya has done a partnership for a campaign with non-NGOs to get the Kenyan government to scrutinize pesticides and ban them if possible. Where are you in this debate? How open is the South African government?
Well, I think civil society increasingly is becoming more visible and more vocal, more coherent, more organized around this issue. At the moment, I think our big focus, maybe three main issues that we are focusing on. One is to get the pesticides that are currently banned in the EU, but still used in South Africa, calling for a ban of those pesticides. So I think that would be step one. Step two would be an overhaul, a modernization of our existing legislation. Our laws currently date back to 1947. So they're terribly outdated, not fit for purpose. So they need to be totally overhauled. The government also needs to build its own capacity to more effectively monitor and regulate, regulate pesticides that are used in South Africa. So I think the big focus at the moment is on our government and getting this, getting our ducks in a row. But I think what we are also saying is that, again, just like has been said, we're not looking at that in isolation. It needs to be looked at as part of the bigger campaign that we are driving, and that is around, again, the transition to agroecology. And in order to get to agroecology, we are also calling on the government to provide encouragement, support, incentives, and so on, to transition to an agroecological future, which would obviously include the phasing out of hazardous pesticides en route to that. And I think all of this, really, the umbrella that frames our discussion is around looking at the food system. the fact that the food system does not work for the farm workers who produce the food. Many of those farm workers go to bed hungry. Many of those farm workers do not earn a living wage. Their rights are violated. So really looking at the food system from a social justice perspective and looking at what the needs are of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, quite right. I'll have to jump to a different point, which is a very nice question from the chat. Ophelia Nick, I forgot the name, but one person asked, Germany is a funding company, funding body of the FAO, but if Germany is starting to ban the export of prohibited pesticides, what is the role your ministry can take? Are you going to put pressure on the FAO in this respect? Are there strategies? Well, we've looked at pesticides. I've got 10 topics on my desk already today. I have 40 days in office, and one of the weeks was a Christmas week, and so we should have a lot of things ready. And I think we have to say here, we don't have done everything yet, but yes, of course, we have to talk about this as a financing party. There is more to that. CMS and what else organizations are there that get money? Quite sums, considerable sums as well, and some don't get much. So maybe sort of reallocation could be thought. And what I heard from the descriptions so far, whether it's women in agriculture, agricultural ecology, a lot of topics, different with different approaches worldwide, different and similar at the same time. So it's a lot of things. Yes, I think it's considerably, substantially identical, however different the structures in the individually may be. All over in many areas, there are precarious working labor conditions in many countries of the world, that women are especially vulnerable. And I also think it is astonishing that it's the same that governments take a tough job to set up ambitious programs. If Colette tells us that the South African government, we experienced the same thing in Kenya, is not ambitious at all in moving forward. Of course, they say we understand the problems and the double standards and what's caused by them, and we do something. Yes. Lena, finally, again, looking at the international point of view, and you, I know in your research, you have been confronted with the national export ban will not do much because China, India, whoever, other producers will fill the gap and just replace it. That is, this argument is everywhere. What is your answer to this? Why is it still so important to act now and here? Thank you for that important question. Max Oljana has mentioned this and found good words to illustrate how important it is to take a model role here. I think this is one of the core points because Germany obviously has taken a special role. We have Bayer and BASF as number 2 and 3 in that market, and it's in front of our own doorstep. So we have a special responsibility for that. They do a third or a quarter of the turnover with these pesticides, and most of that in the global south. So as a civil society in Germany here, we have the obligation to pressure our government, and our government has the task to clearly ban these standards and stop these double standards. And I think this is what no government should exclude itself from and say this is discussed on the EU level. I think this is something that I'd like to tell Ms. Nick. We have a high expectation that you, as new federal government, are ready to fight these corporates and go into uncomfortable discussions. Your predecessor, Ms. Klöckner, was rather friends with the corporates, and we do have hopes that there is a change of paradigms now with the new government, and that this export ban, or what's just been mentioned on the FAO level, things may take their change now. Lena, I'd like to ask and extend that question, the question of Bettina Rotloff from the audience. Till now, the WTO has not been mentioned. Codex ICP, isn't that the crucial level, is her question? Also, with respect to the setting the standards, how audits are done, and so on. Have you looked into this topic as well as to what role at the end of the day, the WTO or Codex and Co can play a role? Well, there's quite a range of agreements in place ruling the international trade, the Rotterdam Agreement, for example, with hazardous substances which are subject to approval. The importing country has to agree that these are allowed to be imported. The problem is that these binding agreements only cover a marginal part of all the substances, only 3.4%, and of them are covered in the respective lists as annexes to these agreements. So this is a paper tiger, really. That won't take us far. This is why, of course, on UN level, we need a different legal approach and other mechanisms and an ambitious approach to fighting these different pesticides. Then we would not need so many clauses in our trade agreements. Okay, yes. And another question to you, Marcus. Christian Schliemann asks how you see the contribution of industrial agriculture, transgenius, GMOs in combination with pesticides, and how much do you see that as an enclosed, comprehensive marketing package and its effect on the climate change? So he says, exceeds the boundaries, and he'd like to know what responsibilities does the agricultural corporates bear for climate change, biodiversity, clearing forests for large-scale industrial agriculture. And the important question is, are the current mandatory human rights due diligence laws enough to take responsibility, assign responsibility for harm done? It's a long question I read out. I hope you got it.
Thank you, Christine. It is a long question, but I think I want to seize on two elements of it. One is the integrated dimension of the problems that we see at hand. So in this panel, of course, we're discussing about double standards in the export of banned pesticides, and in a way, this is an easy problem to fix. it's low-hanging fruit in that sense. The bigger problem is pesticides in industrial agriculture and the toxification of a planet, which connects and intersects with a range of other problems, as the question rightly points out, including climate change. So the efforts of decarbonization go in hand with, or must go in hand with, the efforts of detoxification. This has implications for a wide range of issues. And for example, this is currently being discussed at the international level in the current phase of replenishment of the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, which is the financial mechanism for several of the key multilateral environmental agreements that are facing the triple crisis of climate emergency, biodiversity loss, and toxification. So there is no doubt that integration is able to capture the synergistic effects between these various fields. So that's at one level. At another level, I understood the question to ask, what is business's responsibility for this? And that question, and are existing due diligence initiatives at the national level sufficient? And I think that the question is double-fold. International human rights is evolving to increasingly recognize the responsibilities of private actors for environmental harm. The climate change and human rights litigation I referred to earlier is a clear case in point, but it's not just climate change. There's a whole range of other fields that are falling into this area, including workers' rights. We see very interesting litigation going on currently, for example, in South Africa in regards to contamination in Zambia by lead of the then operations in Kabwe of Anglo American. So there's a range of sectors that are speaking to how businesses cannot and should no longer escape accountability when they cause or contribute to environmental harm that further has implications for the effective enjoyment of human rights. So that is a matter of principle. Then are current initiatives at the national level sufficient? Well, they're being tested. They're being tested in court. I would say that largely, currently, my view is that they're not enough. They're not sufficient, and they should be further strengthened. The voluntary approaches, largely voluntary, that are embedded or reflected in the guiding principles on business and human rights when it comes to due diligence, they should find compelling. They should find compulsory action at the national level. And for example, the negotiations on a treaty on transnational corporations and human rights is attempting to move in that direction to level the playing field so that due diligence is not just a wishful or a good thing to do, but is actually a legal requirement, and failure to carry it out effectively may have also legal implications and secure an effective remedy to the victims. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it is a complex question with many parts, and a very good one at that, putting the finger right on an area that needs further development at the national and international level, due diligence for businesses.
Ja. Wir sind jetzt auch schon rum.
Quite right. And we are over time-wise. However, I would like to initiate one final round. And normally, in the end, we start with what do you wish for to take next? I think that's what we have been talking about sufficiently today. We've all done so. And this is why I'd like to know, what are you all doing next? What is going to happen in INKOTA, Women on Farms? What, Marcus, are you going to do, Marcus Oriana? What is the most important contribution in order to handle the problem of the double standards? Maybe we'll start quite quick and brief, short and sweet. Could be a single sentence that's what I'm going to do over the next couple of months with my organization, with our partners. Who wants to give it a start?
If no one wants to go first, I would say, Markus, you have just spoken. So what's your contribution? What are the most important projects for you in the near future?
Thanks, Christine. So I'll mention two things. It's one of the mandates, functions and tasks to respond to people, groups, local communities and indigenous peoples that reach out to the mandate, bringing their cases of human rights violations to my attention. And so working on those cases with the communities, learning about them, and then being able to present communications, that's the technical term of what is an official letter to a government with allegations of human rights violations. That's ongoing work, and it's going to be focusing on the continuing impacts of pesticides on the rights of people and communities in the fields. So that's one thing that's coming up. And a second aspect of ongoing work is I plan to very closely follow, monitor, and engage the EU process for the elaboration and the implementation of its chemical strategy. I think there's lots of promise in that, in the move to a toxic-free environment, and I hope that the rapporteurship, the special procedure of the Council, can contribute its expertise to that process. Thank you.
Super, vielen Dank.
Great, thank you very much. Colette, what are your next most important projects?
I think in South Africa at home, Women on Farms project with other civil society organizations will continue to pressurize our government to ban pesticides that are already banned in the EU. And secondly, at a more international level, we will continue to work with our partners in the global north, like Rosa Luxemburg, HBS, Oxfam Germany, to lobby and to continue putting some pressure on the new government in Germany to expedite initiatives that they have initially espoused.
Vielen Dank, Colette.
Thank you very much, Colette. Ophelia, Nick, what are your next steps? Well, thank you very much for the very interesting event. And as we say in Germany, speaking helps. So it means that we have to speak a lot. And now I'm taking home your messages. And also what I've heard at other events. I will bring this back to the leadership of my ministry and also the German parliament. And then I hope that when we talk again, maybe in 1 year from now, again on this topic, that we will have made a huge step forward. Thank you very much. We are looking forward to this. And then, Lena, Luik, what are INKOTA's plans? Well, the first point is quite fitting to what Ms. Nick has just said. Well, we will also try to keep up the dialogue with the new federal government. And of course, this was only a beginning of an exchange, a dialogue on this very important topic. And maybe we can also make a contribution so that we have an effective piece of legislation eventually. This is one aspect. And on the other hand, we as INKOTA will continue to exert pressure on Bayer and BASF. Over the past 5 years, we have always been present at their shareholders' meetings, and we will continue to do that this year as well in one or the other form. And thirdly, we will continue to keep up the exchange with our partners in the Global South, and we will try to support them on the one hand in the fight against hazardous pesticides and double standards, and on the other hand, also for in eco-agroecology. Thank you very much. Great. What we will do next is that we will have the pesticide atlas that we published at the beginning of last week, also translated into other languages and also into other country versions, together with our partners PAN Germany and also the BUND. And last but not least, I would like to thank all the guests, all the participants. Thank you very much for taking the time, for being here tonight, for answering all the questions, for the discussion with me. And also thank you very much to Susan Huffmans and Jan Orhan for your inputs at the beginning of this event. Thank you very much for jointly having this event together with INKOTA, PAN Germany, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. And I wish you a nice evening. Bye-bye. See you soon. Thank you.